Hi, everyone, and welcome to our live stream. My name is Mon. I'm really excited to welcome you to the moment with MoveOn. We're talking about foreign policy tonight. Now, I have a really exciting lineup for you, but before we go there, I just want to mention my pronouns are she, hers. I'm going to be your host for this evening. I'd love to learn a little bit more about you, so if you can share in the chat your first name, your pronouns, where you're viewing the series from. And let's see, we got some folks from Northern California. That's great. From Congresswoman Lee's district. Have Ann from New York. We're happy to have you. We have Steve from Chicago and Allison from Minneapolis. This is exciting. My first experience with MoveOn members, and you're all from all over the country. We're really excited to have you joining us tonight. So we're actually going to be having an amazing lineup. This is a rarity for foreign policy space. Whether it's supporting a candidate, fighting to pass progressive legislation, or working to change this world into one where all can thrive, MoveOn members are committed to an inclusive and progressive future. So we're welcoming you to, whether you're a part of the MoveOn community or this is your first time joining us, we're glad you're here with us tonight. We have a great program planned for today. We got Hoda Katebi, our incredible powerhouse organizer. I'm excited to welcome and introduce in a moment. We have our executive director, Rahna Epting, who's going to be speaking with us, and we have Congresswoman Lee joining us. This is exciting. It's an all-woman panel. It's an all-woman of color panel, something really rare for foreign policy. We're going to be talking about a lot of issues tonight, everything from the most recent crisis to withdrawing from the war in Afghanistan. Who else do we have tonight? We got Ashley, Maddie from New Hampshire. I'm really excited to talk about this with you. So I know a lot of you folks joined us, you heard about progressive foreign policy, intersectional foreign policy, a lot of words that just really mean it's an opportunity for us to prioritize our values, both at home and abroad, to prioritize people and human dignity and the values we aspire to have, not just here, but around the world, and to put people before profit and corporations, even those who profit from the war industry. So tonight we're going to be breaking that down and talking about not just words like intersectional, but we're going to be talking about what is it that we aspire to have in this world and what's that vision of the world we're looking for. We like to start out with an icebreaker. So I'm actually really excited to welcome our first speaker. Our first guest is Hoda Katebi. She's a writer, an activist, and organizer, currently based in Chicago. She's an outspoken voice for progressive foreign policy. She's also one of my favorite people to do anti-war organizing, and she's a great organizer. Welcome, Hoda.
Salam, merci, that was so sweet. Thank you so much for MoveOn for having me. And Mana June, this is so cute. I'm really excited to talk with you in front of hundreds of people. It's great.
Thanks. Thousands. We're going to be talking about foreign policy.
My apologies. I'm only on the Zoom, so.
So Hoda, as our first guest, we like to do this really special icebreaker. We'd like to ask you, just to get to know you, can you tell us about what is your earliest memory of fighting injustice and what got you involved in fighting for what's right?
Wow, I love icebreakers. I hope you got the sarcasm in my voice. Yeah, I think, well, I was born and raised in Oklahoma, so there wasn't like a lot of opportunities to really get involved into like groundbreaking social justice work. But I think a lot of like early on, it was like environmental justice work. But I think it really was very clear to me as like a visible Muslim woman growing up in Oklahoma that I was going to have to respond to anything that had to do with foreign policy in any country in the Middle East. And so I started learning about things pretty early on, just because I was put in that position and sort of that was forced on me. But I think a lot of my like deeper radicalization and really understanding of the world and foreign policy came from Palestine, which I think is a fitting thing to talk about, especially today, given the ongoing ethnic cleansing of the villages of or neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. And really just the ways in which, as a Muslim person, as an Iranian, as a person of color, the ways in which this country's media, the people how we learn about the Middle East, how we learn about other people, and how that affects our foreign policy. And yeah, I think it was a really important starting point for me in really understanding both in the ways that like the these systems and structures exist in the media, they exist in our schools, they exist in the ways people interact with each other. So it was really, really sort of overwhelming and like complex and in coming in so many different ways. And I think that allowed me to also plug into like local BLM solidarity organizing. So I think it all connects. And that's what I'm really excited to talk about, is just really how deeply interconnected what's happening here actually is to movements abroad as well too.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm seeing some folks mention, such an important point, how the media affects our sense of the world and international issues. It's really interesting in particular when we talk about these issues and they touch home for you. So that's incredibly important for you to share with us. Thank you. Now, one thing you and I are both tireless advocates for is the need for diplomacy first, equitable, progressive, and just foreign policy. That might seem like an abstract concept, especially with all the words I threw in there, but particularly in a time when we're talking about two forever wars and on the brink of ending one, could you help synthesize that for our members? What does it mean when we talk about a progressive intersectional diplomacy first foreign policy? And what does that look like to you?
Yeah, I love this question. And I think what's really, what I hate, but I also have to say every time we talk about like global politics, is that I think a lot of us are trying to imagine this world that doesn't have borders, that doesn't have these like really repressive state apparatuses that control everything that comes in and out, that creates identities based on arbitrary lines drawn that now create like different nationalities. And yet that already exists, and that exists for corporations, that exists for companies like Boeing that just received a $725 million arms deal for Israel, and that exists in surveillance companies that we experience both as people of color here in the United States, that is shared between Israel, that data is shared between China, that's shared between India and its occupation of Kashmir. So I think when we're thinking about what does progressive foreign policy look like, in reality, it kind of already exists, but it exists for the wrong people. It exists for capitalism. It exists for corporations. They get to live in this borderless world. They get to live in this world of little sort of corporate or state control. And yet we can't imagine that. So we still can't imagine what it would feel like for a state to take care of all of the people, regardless of citizenship within its land. We can't imagine what it would feel like to actually build relationships and share and collaborate and be inspired by people around the world and create something bigger than ourselves. But people are doing it. Corporations are doing that. And so I think what is really important for us as people living in the United States is to recognize that a world exists beyond our borders. And as simple as that sounds, I think people really do tend to forget that. And an important reason is that we're living in an active empire. The United States continues to steal land from indigenous people, continues to extract resources from indigenous lands, and continues to extract resources from around the world. And so when we're thinking about why we don't recognize that a world exists outside of our borders, we have to understand why that is and what actually is happening. And that we do live in an active empire, and as such, we have certain responsibilities that come with that in being able to dismantle the US empire and all of the different forms that it looks like. US empire looks like militarism, it looks like troops on the ground, it looks like bombs, it also looks like collaborations between local police and the Israeli Defense Forces. It also looks like giving huge corporate deals and sort of tax breaks to major surveillance companies. It also looks like the way that we treat each other and the way that we even learn about each other. And that goes back to media again. So I think that there's so many ways that we've sort of internalized colonization, we've internalized the empire. And I think that a lot of that work happens abroad and a lot of that work happens here. And the decolonization that starts on this stolen land that we're living in right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm seeing some folks in the chat are agreeing with you. Allison saying, wow, it exists for the capitalism instead of for people. We got someone talking about we need a challenge where our resources are going, how data is being used, and who defines what borders. Allison, again, we live in an active empire. So a lot of folks that's resonating with Hoda. Thank you so much. And we have a great question. Someone asked, what's the USA bubble we live in and all we take for granted as part of an active empire? And I'm actually going to let us ask that question before I ask you the question I had for you.
Oh, the question is, what is the US bubble? we live in and what we take for granted? Oh, quite literally everything. It's a great question. I think, for example, like I think that we allow ourselves to really regurgitate the language of the state. And I think particularly when it comes to communities that we don't know, countries that we don't know, I'm gonna take a leap and assume that if I ask anybody that's watching this right now to point to where Waziristan is on the map, A, you've either never heard of it, and this is the first time that you're hearing of it, you think it's a made up place, or B, you probably can't point to it on a map. And that's okay, because we're not learning about what America is doing. We don't know why Waziristan is important for like people living in the United States to know what it is, but it's the most heavily drone striked area in the world by the United States. And so that's just one example of like the US empire is just so massive, and its tentacles are both within the physical world that we live in, but also within our minds and our hearts and the ways that we understand and take in the world, or what we feel like is important. In our education systems, for example, the fact that we look at a map, and many of us as an adult, like myself still growing up in this country, I can't point to many countries on a map, and that's truly embarrassing. And I think that many other countries around the world know what's happening, generally what's happening with their neighbors, why things are happening. But I think because we have this level of fear that the government uses against us, that, oh, there's always a terrorist lurking over your shoulder. Oh, they're always trying to attack us. But when we look at reality, America has been in the longest war of its existence. America is constantly aggressing in other countries, stealing resources, creating military bases over oil pipelines. And I think if we're able to actually take back the narrative and listen to the voices on the ground that are systemically silenced from us, I think that allows us to break through that bubble a little bit. And I think that's also one really important thing that is really indicative, is that we don't hear the voices of people in Iran. We don't hear the voices of people in Iraq, the people in Syria, the people in Waziristan. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that if we actually heard those voices, if those voices were allowed to be shared in mainstream media, the entire conception of the US empire would be completely destroyed. We realize that we're not actually spreading democracy, we're bombing people. And so I think it really allows us to understand all of the nonsense that the US sort of feeds us, and that we normalize, even this idea of criminality, for example. Everything, I think if we are able to take a step back and think about, what does safety actually look like? Does it look like America dropping bombs in Afghanistan? Or does it look like America investing those resources into creating healthcare, into creating more education, more access to public health? And so I think that's really at the center of this question, is what is the language that we've learned from the state, but then what is the actual reality, and how can we take that back for ourselves?
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I think, Hoda, I mean, that's really important, everything you said. It reminds me of something I heard recently, which is, the United States, its history has had some of the most important and profound moments for foreign policy. Like in some ways, there's really beautiful history of like developing like the human rights framework. And there's been moments, in terms of like rebuilding places. And also part of America's history that we have to contend with is exactly what you're talking about, which is how do Afghans, majority who are really young and don't remember a time living in Afghanistan without US presence and military presence, how do they feel about Americans? Like how do folks in Iran, when we talk about sanctions and we talk about Iranians who've, been part of really beautiful democratic moments, the first democratic election in the country, how do folks in Iran think about the US when we talk about sanctions and preventing their families from being able to get access to medicine? So I think that's really beautiful. We have a couple questions for you that I'm going to share, but I wanted to actually get to one more question on foreign policy I had for you, which is, sometimes when we talk about foreign policy issues, it can seem very abstract. And I'm sure for a lot of folks, even I right now, I've worked with Hoda a lot, and I just learned some new incredible points from her. But every time we talk about it, it just seems like it's something abstract to people who aren't directly involved. What would you say to our members? And I know you've shared a lot about how we're so involved in what's happening around the world, and also everything that's happening around the world, particularly from the US, is affecting us, our access to healthcare, what resources come back into our country. But what would you say to our members is a good way to take action in demanding this vision of a humane, a progressive foreign policy that's intersectional and that puts human dignity and lives first?
Thank you. Everything you just said. I think you answered the question really beautifully. I think a lot of it does start with just being able to listen. And challenge yourself, like challenge everything that you take for granted, and especially when it comes from the state. And I think if we've learned anything when it comes to Iran, for example, why America has put sanctions on Iran, what can be sanctioned, what isn't sanctioned, we know that that's all lies. I think one thing that we can learn very well from specifically the Iranian context, but in general foreign policy, is that the government lies to you. I hope this is not the first time that you're hearing this, but it's true, unfortunately. And I think we can just look at our history, look at domestic history, you know, of justifying slavery, justifying, racial segregation, everything that has been just horrible. There's legal justifications for it. There's moral and economic justifications. So I think there's always going to be a reason why this country or the state does something that's violent, globally or domestically. And so I think it's so important for us to be able to identify that and listen to who's on the ground, and more importantly, understand what that means for us and what we actually want. So a few things that I really hope people walk away with is like complexity is good. And I think this comes up a lot, especially in foreign policy. It's like, oh, that's too complex to think about. Oh, like, I don't know, it's just complex. Complexity is good, right? We shouldn't run away from what is complex, because you will never stop running. Everything is complicated. It's the world, it's politics. But that doesn't mean that you don't have an obligation to understand what is happening. But there are also things that aren't complicated, like settler colonialism is not complicated. Apartheid isn't really complicated. The history of sanctions on Iraq that has killed 1.5 million people, that has created lasting generational violence and trauma, is not super complicated. So I think that what is really important for us to do is to be able to embrace complexity, but also recognize that not everything has to be complex, and we should be focusing and centering the people's voices on the ground who are affected, not the people in power. And that's very different, because the American state, the Iranian state, the Saudi state, the Israeli state, and the people in power will always push their narrative, just as we just talked about with the United States. So we can't just like listening to people abroad and, oh, because they live there, they know what they're talking about. No, we're talking about people who are harmed. And so when we're able to center and uplift their voices, we actually can get a clear idea of what's happening. And I think also something that Mana mentioned that I think is really important that I want to uplift is that this isn't just something happening over there to random people. This affects all of us. So even if you don't care about people who look like me, so be it. I will not convince you of that, but it affects you. And so if you care about your own healthcare, if you care about where your tax money is going and your own complicity in apartheid, your own complicity in genocide, it matters. And so you do have to give a damn a little bit about this. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, but you do have to care, because everything is connected. Policing the United States is connected to militarism, both domestically and abroad. Our healthcare, our lack of healthcare, I should say, is connected to the fact that the United States military is eating up the entire budget. We're all so concerned about recycling and paper straws. I'm sorry, I hate paper straws, but we don't recognize that the US military is the number 1 contributor to global warming and climate change. And so if we actually are able to take this step back and recognize our complexity, our complicity within all of this, that allows us to also understand where we're supposed to start that fight. Because paper straws are important, sure, right, a few seals or whatever. I'm sorry, but at the end of the day, if we're trying to address climate change, we have to look about who is the biggest contributors to climate change. If we're trying to increase healthcare, increase access to mental health, what are those resources that are draining it? It's policing, it's militarism. And the last 2 things I'll mention, because I know I'm like short on time, is that liberation, this idea of freedom, this ability to have access to everything that you need, is not going to come from the state. And I want to make sure that we all recognize this very, very clearly, is a state that's rooted in and built off of slavery on the stolen land of indigenous people who they continue to oppress, people whose empire, all these resources are stolen, is not made for me, and most likely not you either. It's not made for us. And so if we're able to actually sit and imagine the world that we want, not just what we think is achievable, quote unquote, or what capitalism has sort of limited our imagination to, but really what do you need to thrive? Like, what does that world look like? What do those relationships look like? And being able to start there, we recognize that it's always going to be a people's movement. It's always going to be grassroots, and it's always going to exist outside of the state. And it's going to be on our terms. So I think that's really, really important, to be able to not compromise for things that you want. Don't compromise your demands. If you want the military out, you say the military out. If you want to abolish the military, you say abolish the military. So I think it's really important that we know what we want to achieve that world, and we fight for it every single day, and we don't allow ourselves to compromise. So imagination is great.
I have one question for you. We're a little limited on time. You have so many fans, so many folks giving you a shout out. I want to give a real quick shout out to our youngest listener, my niece Roxy, who's just learned so much from you at age 9 and who I love. And thank you to her mom, Alia, to have Roxy with us today. I'm so proud to have you. So we have one question for you, Hoda. What would you encourage the chat to read, research, look into if they want to learn more?
Amazing question. Also, thank you so much, Roxy Jewett, for tuning in. Keep learning. And also listen to Mana. She's brilliant. Anything that she says, just follow along. Okay, this is a really good question, and also very hard. I think there are a lot of sources. First of all, I mean, I recommend, if there are people on the ground, follow them. Like, if there are Palestinian journalists, follow them. It's really easy to be able to learn about what's happening when it's always on your newsfeed and you don't have to pick up a book to learn about what's happening. I love reading and I encourage it, but I recognize we're not in a generation or a world anymore that people love reading. So we're all on Twitter. So get on Twitter and you can learn on Twitter. But as long as your feed reflects the world and the relationships that you want, you're going to be in a good place. So I think being able to see who, like, look at who I'm following, look at who Mana's following, and follow those people. And it's a good place to start. Think about people who are really being able to stand up for what they believe in, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in different countries. So I think that's really, really important. In terms of reading, Haymarket, go to Haymarket Books, read anything, just read anything. Verso Books, Pluto Books, any of these amazing publishers, just scroll down, buy some stuff, read it, support not Amazon. And yeah, I mean, I do think reading is really important, but you can also just follow people who are on the ground living in these countries and actually talking the good talk, fighting the good fight.
Hoda's being very humble right now and not mentioning that she started Because We've Read, which is an international book club that does actually have incredible readings, and they make all those readings accessible. So you can definitely follow that as well. And thanks for the Haymarket shout. That's definitely a place to go. So thank you, Hoda. We've had a wonderful time with you. I'm sure we could have just spent another couple hours with you, but we appreciate you. And we got some folks that want to just thank you so much. There are folks that are going to follow you. Yeah. Lots of quotes from you, people saying thank you so much. We had a great time with you tonight.
Mana June. And thank you so much, Jordan and Rahna and everybody for setting this up. I really appreciate it. And good luck with the rest of the live stream. I hope it's super cute.
Thank you. So it's my incredible honor to introduce Rahna Epting, MoveOn's executive director, someone I'm a huge fan of, a powerhouse organizer, and someone who I learned so much about leadership from. She's going to join us to talk about helping understand what's at stake, what you can do about it. So help me welcome MoveOn's executive director, Rahna Epting.
Thank you, Mana. Thank you, Hoda. I want to express my great appreciation for Hoda and her insight and wisdom and perspective that she shared with us tonight. Her voice is so important, and I'm honored that she chose to be here with us, the big, beautiful MoveOn community this evening. I'm also really excited about our next guest coming up shortly, a true champion for peace and sensible foreign policy, Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She's not here yet. She's going to come later, but I'm just super excited. I wanted to share that in case you didn't realize she'll be joining us today. Time and time again, Congresswoman Lee has been right when so many others have been on the wrong side of history. Time and time again, she has had the courage to stand up, even when others would not. And time again, she has challenged Democratic and Republican administrations and she's consistently been a true champion for peace. And I'm honored she'll be with us here tonight. And lastly, to all of you, the thousands of you watching at home, you're taking out valuable time during your evening to join this important conversation about the state of our current foreign policy, a vision for a more just and humane one, and most importantly, to learn more about how you can take action. Advocating for a sensible and humane foreign policy and against the endless wars of the last 20 years is at the core of who we are as an organization, as a people, as MoveOn. Back when President Bush, a long time ago, remember President George W. Bush? Back when he was lying to send our nation into the deadly and unnecessary Iraq War, MoveOn and MoveOn members, just like you, if not you yourself, were at the forefront of the anti-war movement. We took to the streets and the halls of Congress, first trying to stop the war from ever starting, and in the years since to end our involvement. That's how I got started at MoveOn. That may have been how many of you joined so long ago. When President Obama proposed the historic Iran deal, MoveOn members were once again at the forefront, demanding that Congress approve the deal and pushing back against hawks in both parties. And when President Trump, he's gone now, but when President Trump pursued a reckless, dangerous, and isolationist foreign policy, MoveOn members, all of us, we are once again on the front lines, pushing back and demanding accountability, marching against an escalation to war with Iran, and so much more. This is who we are. This is who we've always been. It is core to our humanity, to who we are as an activist community, and who we are as MoveOn. So welcome tonight. Turning the page from the disastrous foreign policy of the last administration will not be easy, and it will not happen overnight. It also is not enough to just turn the page. We need to pursue a new just foreign policy that is intersectional, as Mana and Hoda talked about earlier, progressive, and centers diplomacy. There have been some really encouraging signs from the Biden administration, I have to admit, rejoining the Paris climate deal within the first 100 days, speaking diplomacy with Iran, and Biden's historic decision to end America's longest war, the war in Afghanistan. These are tremendous steps in the right direction. It's putting us on a much better path. Already in Washington, neoconservatives, warmongers, hawks, whatever you want to call them, they're already fighting back on Biden's moves. And we need to organize and focus to get Biden's back. For decades, these hawks have had far too much power over US foreign policy. And the only thing pushing back against them is us. The power of our collective voices, for us to speak up together, to show up together, demand better from our elected leaders and our government, and not just in times of crises, when maybe we're on the brink of war, but we need to be there consistently throughout, and we need you there with us. This is a vital moment for us to break free from all of that. It is why we're here tonight, and it will be a focus of the work that we all get to do moving forward. The administration is getting a lot of pushback for its decision to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. This is a historic decision that honestly should have never fallen to Biden in the first place. It should have been done years ago. There is no military solution to Afghanistan. We've known that for years. Yet America has been marred in the longest war in our nation's history for nearly 20 years. For nearly 20 years. We applaud the president's action, and we hope he will follow it up with a plan to also withdraw the more than 16,000 contractors who remain in the country. This all must be done, of course, while protecting the most vulnerable, innocent Afghans, particularly those who helped our troops and those who have been marginalized. Fighting against endless wars and working with champions like Congresswoman Barbara Lee to repeal the use of force authorizations in Congress. That's a tongue twister. But that work has been the longest running campaign in the history of MoveOn. This is a tremendous victory. We all should be proud. It wouldn't have happened without public pushback without years of organizing and the work of millions of people like all of us for over more than 20 years. And while Biden has made great progress, there are places where we really need to push because of the forces that are going to push us back into a warlike posture on the rise of war and escalation of tensions. We still need to push. Our role, just because we elected Biden, doesn't mean we can rest. We actually get to push a petitionable federal government at this point. So there are a couple of places that we really want to focus on moving forward. Number one is Israel-Palestine. We all watched the latest violence in Israel and Palestine with horror. The death and destruction was heartbreaking. I don't think anyone can argue against that. And the international response was very one-sided. While we're thankful for the ceasefire, which is necessary, the administration and the international community must do more for the people of Palestine who have lived through an occupation for decades. We have nearly $4 billion a year in US military aid to Israel. And the Biden administration has a responsibility because of this to hold the Israeli government accountable for the bombing of innocent people, including children. The US government must also call on the Israeli government to stop forced evictions, to stop mass arrests, and other policies meant to harm and escalate tensions. We will talk more about this later in our stream. Second area is Yemen. We have so much work to do with the Biden administration when it comes to the Saudi blockade of Yemen. While sadly, this has not made the front pages of many newspapers, millions in Yemen are being starved as a result of the Saudi enforced blockade on their country. A blockade the US has supported and not done enough to stop. And a blockade that the administration has not been transparent about. This suffering is preventable, and we will be pushing the administration to do more. We, all of us, will be pushing the administration to do more. So as we gather here tonight to appreciate the turning of the page from the last administration, but also we have a clear understanding there's much work left for us still to do, which is why I am so thrilled to have you all here tonight and why I can't wait for the rest of this evening's program. But before I hand it over, I want to encourage every single one of you watching right now to join us at the following website at justiceoverborders.org. And you can sign up to continue to engage on the issue of a progressive and for a diplomatic foreign policy rooted in love, in justice, and human dignity. So go to justiceoverborders.org and sign up and you continue to engage. We can't just be engaging in moments of crises. Yes, we need you in moments of crises, but we need you also in an ongoing way so that we can affect the change we all know is possible. That vision of the world that Hoda talked about earlier, that is not within the bounds of what our society has made us believe that we have, but what is in the bounds of our imagination, and recreate a community, a government, a society that truly allows everyone to thrive, that is built and believe that if you're better off and I'm better off, we are all better off, and more. So go to justiceoverborders.org, and I'm going to thank you for being here again and for all the work you do and all the time you contribute to MoveOn and in your community. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Mana.
Thank you, Rahna. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. And we're incredibly honored and grateful for your leadership. I know there are a lot of questions. There are a lot of thanks and a lot of comments. You got a lot of fans, Rahna. But I do want to I'm unfortunately not going to be able to ask you a question because we have a really special guest.
Get to our special guest. She's
yes. One of my highlights of my career this will be because I get to introduce Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Congresswoman Lee has been the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Congresswoman Lee is a strong progressive. She's a wonderful leader, someone that we're very honored and grateful to have in Congress. She's been a major force in the anti-war movement. Congresswoman Lee bravely cast the lone no vote against the authorization of use of force after September 11th, the single vote that has been vindicated over time. We are grateful for you. I'm a super fan of yours. Everyone, we're honored to have you with us today. Congresswoman Lee, welcome.
Thank you. Is it Mana?
Mana.
Mana. Okay, Mana and Rahna. Let me just say, first of all, how wonderful it is to be with you. And I listened to Rahna, and I really just want to say thank you for laying this out, because you have exactly the spirit and the intellect and the commitment to get to, and we still haven't. A lot of people don't talk about peace, but that's our whole goal is peace. And so you laid out how we got there. So thank you so much for that. And let me just say hello to everyone with MoveOn. Now, I have to tell you, I have bragging rights with MoveOn. It was founded in my district, okay, in Berkeley, California. I've been with MoveOn since day one. And I don't know if any of you all were around in the, right early 2000s, right after 2001, when MoveOn brought some petitions to Capitol Hill. From what I remember, maybe 300,000 signatures. And I was the member of Congress that found the room, the committee room. I was the one who accepted the petitions. No other member of Congress would show up, but of course, I'm going to be there. And I was so proud to be there at that moment when MoveOn brought the voices of the people to Capitol Hill as it relates to stopping the war that was about to start. So I just have to say thank you to MoveOn, because you all have led the way from day one. But I feel like that I know I am part of the MoveOn family. And so I just have to just say how proud I am for what all of you have done, and the supporters throughout the country, throughout the world. And so, withdrawing from Afghanistan, this is long overdue. We shouldn't have gone there in the first place. And I voted against it, that resolution. It was 60 words. And it was a blank check for endless war. And all it said, if you haven't read it, is the president is authorized to go to war forever. And it said connected to and associated forces responsible for 9/11, any nation, organization, or associated force. I mean, it was so broad. I don't know how anyone could have voted for that. But you got to understand the environment we were in, the world. Our country, we were in mourning. We were angry. We don't know what in the heck happened. And the word, not on the street, but the word everywhere in the country was, don't be partisan. You got to unify. You got to be with the president. You got to be with Bush. This is not the time to be a Democrat. This is the time to be an American. And okay, all fine and good. And I'm not looking at the world through rose-colored glasses either. I understand what a terrorist attack means. Also, my dad was in the military 25 years. So I'm an Army brat, and I know you don't send our troops in harm's way until you know exactly what you're doing, and that's the last option. So all of this came to play, and then I read it again. I tried to help the Democrats craft a more narrow authorization. No way, we couldn't do anything. And so it was hard for me to vote against that, but I went to the memorial service, and I had been talking to our beloved Elijah Cummings in the cloakroom, and I wasn't going to go, but I'm giving you this backstory, just how I got to this point. I'd said, no, I think I'm going to go. And I was the last person who ran down the steps of the Capitol with a ginger ale in my hand. It was a gloomy, rainy day. I went, and I'm so glad I went, because the Reverend Nathan Baxter, who was the head of the National Cathedral, in his eulogy, he said, as we act, let us not become the evil we deplore. Boom, that was it for me. I said, no more, debating in my mind, no more talking to any more people. I talked to my pastor, my mother, my father, with some Marcus Raskin. I don't know if you remember Marcus Raskin from IPS. I talked to Marcus. I talked to some constitutional lawyers, and they too believed it was totally unconstitutional and would take away Congress's responsibility to authorize the use of force in the future, and it will set the stage for forever war. Okay, so I knew it was going to be a tough vote. I didn't know if I was going to be the only one or not, but I voted no, and that was the right vote. And I don't feel like I was vindicated. I wish I had not been vindicated, because so many people, so many of our troops lost their lives. The hundreds of thousands of people in the region died the refugees, the way that the war has just shattered the lives of everyone in Afghanistan. It's time to bring our troops home. It's time to help build a sustainable peace in Afghanistan. It's time to make sure that women are treated fairly and that the movement toward women's and gender equality continues. It's time to protect the most vulnerable in Afghanistan and provide visas for those who need to leave. So we still have a lot of work to do, but let me tell you, we've trained over 100,000 security forces in Afghanistan. We've spent trillions of dollars. And so it's time to bring home. And I too applaud President Biden. You know, I was on the drafting committee for the Democratic Party platform. We were able to write into that platform, and no one ever reads the Democratic Party platform, but because I helped write it, I'm really proud of some of the provisions, a lot of the provisions that we put in provisions as it relates to endless wars, and we have to stop these endless wars and bring our troops home and, you know, provide for real national security, which means we have these three stools of our foreign policy: diplomacy, development, and defense. Defense, military first policy is what this country has been using forever in terms of our foreign policy. It's always a militaristic first foreign policy. So now, as chair of the subcommittee, the appropriations subcommittee that deals with development and diplomacy, you know what I'm doing. I'm trying to get this rebalanced now with funding. I'm proud to say we have an 11% increase. We're up to 61 billion, not enough. I'm trying to get more because we have got a heck of a lot to do in terms of making sure that our development and diplomacy goals are achieved, especially for women, girls, and vulnerable populations in Afghanistan and throughout the world. Finally, I'll just say I'm trying to get that authorization repealed. You all know I've tried every year, probably for the last 18 years. Made some progress. We passed it on the floor. We passed it in the National Defense Authorization Bill, but always they take it out. The Republicans do in the Senate. So we're trying again. We're putting together a team of members of Congress trying to work through and repeal authorization and what that means in terms of trying to bring consensus. And, you know, we have a very diverse caucus, so we're trying to push to regain Congress's constitutional prerogative, well, not prerogative, but requirement that Congress engage in the use of force and authorize it or not. The president has to come to Congress. Congress has to debate it. If we believe that it's warranted, we authorize it. If it's not, we don't authorize it. So that's where we are as it relates to the 2001 authorization. And before I stop, I just want to say one small thing about the 2002 authorization, the Iraq War. Once again, we've been trying year after year after year to repeal that authorization. But I don't know if you've been following this over the years, but this year we got a hearing to repeal it in the Foreign Affairs Committee, which I served on during that period. And next week or very soon, a month ago, it got out of committee with bipartisan support. It's coming to the floor, and we will be debating the repeal of the 2002 authorization to use military force very soon. So that's not just a victory for me. I mean, I feel great that I've been trying to do this with Congresswoman Lynn Woolsey, my sister is the struggle, and Congresswoman Maxine Waters. You may remember we called ourselves a triad. Well, finally, we've gotten to that point where hopefully we'll be able to get the 2002 repealed. And we put that in the Democratic Party platform also. So I'll stop there and just say, because of MoveOn, gosh, 20 years, it's a marathon, but because of MoveOn, we're making progress. We just have to now make more progress toward peace.
Congresswoman Lee, I mean, I think I can speak for everyone when I say we're all just floored and so honored to have you. I keep thinking, what would we have done if you weren't a member of Congress 20 years ago? If we didn't have your leadership? There are a lot of questions. You got a ton of fans. Some of them are with me, but I don't know if they're going to get there. But I do want to ask you one quick question, which is, how do you think the withdrawal is going in terms of actually pulling out forces? Because I know some folks are worried about switching out personnel, reclassifying presence. How do you think we're doing? Do you think we're going to be able to also support Afghans, and particularly those vulnerable communities, women, girls, minorities like Kharrazis, LGBTQ plus folks? How do you feel it's going?
Yeah, and that's I think what you said is the point, and that's what my subcommittee funds. And so I'm working with the Biden administration to make sure we have the funding to do exactly what you said. With regard to the withdrawal, it'll be dicey. The peace talks. Making sure women are at the table, making sure that our troops are secure as we draw down, making sure that everything works smoothly, and that's the big part now, to make sure that it's a safe and orderly withdrawal, but that we leave in Afghanistan what our security personnel need at the embassy, because we do have an embassy there, and make sure that they're secured and that they're able to do their job. But the focus now is on making sure that the women, children, and the entire population of Afghanistan, we support their development efforts, and through diplomacy. So I think we can't say it's going to be perfect, but we can say we're going to try to make it as perfect as we can. And I really do have to thank President Biden. People were shocked. I wrote a letter to President Biden with my Republican colleague early on with Congressman Buck. You need to get a copy of the letter before the withdrawal, a few weeks before. And we were so happy when we saw that we wrote the letter in enough time to make sure that it was in the mix when this decision was made. And so I think, we'll be okay. The Pentagon, I've talked with General Austin, and quite naturally, everyone has focused on making sure that it is orderly and safe. But again, we can't believe that everything will be perfect, but we have to fight to make sure that it goes as well as can be expected, because there is no military solution, like Rahna said. And a couple members say, well, we haven't finished our job there. I'm saying, we've been there 20 years and we haven't finished our job. We're going to be there another 20 years. What job are you talking about? What are we? Come on. Come on. And so there's no way we can win any war in Afghanistan. So we need to forget the military posture. I mean, if there are issues that affect the national security of the United States, we'll debate them and figure out how to respond appropriately. But we have to stop the militarization of wherever we think that there are conflicts, and use our diplomatic and development tools before we pull the trigger on military action.
I have one more question for you. Also, a lot of folks thanking you for that letter. I'm gonna go look it up right after this.
And it was bipartisan with someone, an unlikely ally. So I've been doing this over the years. So let me tell you, working with Republicans on this issue has been quite interesting, but it has been rewarding. And I have to think of Walter Jones. Walter Jones from North Carolina, who helped me so much. He passed away a few years ago, but he helped me break through with many of the Republicans. And so, we don't have a lot, but we have, quite a few who, saw the light. And with the Progressive Caucus, I chair the Global Security Task Force, and we had several years ago a forum on Afghanistan and repealing the authorizations. And myself and a couple other Progressive Caucus members showed up, but we had about 8 or 10 Republicans show up. And so we've been building over the years, but this is a marathon. You got to be persistent. You got to have patience and fight for peace.
You're incredible. I got a question from you from the chat. So the question is, there's a lot that's happening with the blockade in Yemen. Yemen's starving. It's one of the worst humanitarian disaster. But I'm reading from the chat that many folks, particularly the Dems that we would count on, are afraid to do a war powers resolution against a Democratic president. Is that something that you think would be able to be introduced? Is that something that you're thinking about being a part of?
Well, I depending on what it said, I probably would be a part of it. I've joined with Congressman Khanna in all of our efforts around Yemen. And I think, when we have a Democratic president, come on, there's space for different points of views. And I know this president, like I knew President Obama, and they welcome, the kind of different points of views. And we try to negotiate and push. push hard because we have the different points of views in our Democratic caucus. And so if we think that this is the right move, and if the White House knows or disagrees with us, and they know I'm trying to cut the defense budget, for example, by 10%, we'll do the amendment again, Mark Pocan and I, on the defense budget. Well, they came up with an increase in the defense budget, and we say, no, we need to cut it. So I think we know in many respects, can be the loyal opposition. And so as it relates to Yemen, I would join in whatever action that's necessary to make sure we help with not only the humanitarian crisis, but the Saudi role and all of the issues around Yemen, we need to come to grips with and deal with.
I'm pretty sure a couple folks are gonna be contacting you after
Sure.
this. We appreciate you for that. I got one more question if you have a little bit of time.
Okay.
I got a lot of folks in the chat asking about sanctions from different countries. There's Cuba, there's Iran, there's the talk about the Yemen blockade. What other plans do you have for foreign policy? I know you're in the middle of a session, so folks, right now, just Congresswoman Lee joining us tonight is a big deal. But what could you say about some other fights on the Hill around foreign policy?
Well, around foreign policy, from day one, I've tried to end the embargo against Cuba. I want to go back to where the Obama administration stopped, which was beginning to open dialogue, open trade, open, normal travel, the right to Americans to travel to Cuba without such hassles. Just getting back to there and moving forward. So I co-chair the Cuba working group with Republicans, and we want that. And I've talked to the Biden administration. We're waiting on their policy review on Cuba, but I've been pushing them hard. I met with we had the Secretary of State before my committee a couple of days ago, and I asked, when is this policy review going to be completed? Because we've got to move forward with regard to Cuba. With regard to sanctions in general, I'm pushing for the United States to re-enter the JCPOA as it relates to Iran. And I believe that we have to address sanctions that are hurting people everywhere in the world. And hopefully we'll be able to at least, roll back some of the sanctions that were put into place by the Trump administration. In order to get back to the JCPOA to re-enter where we left, we have to address sanctions and they have to address the issues on their side also. With regard to just where we go with foreign policy, as I said earlier, I'm trying to use my subcommittee chair to really reshape our foreign policy and to get more Americans involved in our global affairs. The Sustainable Development Goals, for example, to end poverty, to make sure that racial equity is a priority. All of the issues of the SDGs we need to embrace here in America and say, yes, our own country needs to get to that point. And so I'm working on those issues in my subcommittee, and all of the issues that we've been working on for so long. Now I have, the power of the purse, but I also have colleagues who may not be where I am. So you all have to help us really educate the public, because I can be one vote to do X, Y, and Z. For instance, humanitarian assistance. I'm trying to up to the Palestinians. I'm trying to make sure we open the office in Washington. The consulate is going to be opened in Jerusalem. I'm trying to make sure that we have the funds to help rebuild Gaza and what has taken place in the Middle East. Palestinian children, all of the humanitarian assistance that has been put on hold. That's a priority for me to try to get that money increased for humanitarian assistance and for helping to make sure that impediments to a two-state solution, which some don't even believe in anymore, but some of those impediments, such as settlement expansion and annexation, some of the issues, seeing how we can address them in my subcommittee. So I'm trying to do what I can do, of course, again, recognizing I have Democrats and Republicans who may not be where I am to go along. So we're trying to reshape our foreign policy with you guys helping me.
Well, we're going to support you along the way. We'll show up every moment for you. We have one more question for you to close out. Not a simple one though. It's I can't, but I'm just in awe of you right now. So the question is, there's a little bit of a concern right now with Biden proposing increased military budget, talking about outcompeting China. I'm from Iran. I'm concerned about the way we're pivoting and talking about China, particularly with all of the AAPI hatred, the xenophobia that we've experienced. What can you say about pushing back on that, particularly the increased military budget that's been proposed and the potential for another Cold War with China this time?
Yeah.
And what can we do to show up and help with that?
Well, today we had a budget, I'm on the budget committee, had a budget committee hearing, and my main question to our acting director of OMB, Shalonda Young, was about the military budget and how disappointed I was, again, loyal opposition to the increase, even though they say it's not a huge increase, it's still an increase. And to let them know that I'm gonna do my cutting of 10%. We got 94, 95 votes last year. And we want to cut it by 10%, which is only $74, $75 billion. But what you all could do is help us build support for that amendment when it comes to the floor to cut the military budget or to reduce defense spending. And I asked about waste, fraud, and abuse, the missile systems. The Pentagon's the only agency that has not been audited. And so I want to know when it's going to be audited and to, bring some semblance of stability and fiscal responsibility to the military budget and the Pentagon. So, we have to do that.
Well, we appreciate you for everything you're doing. I'm glad you are the one with the power of the purse. I want to see more power and leadership handed to you. And I know that you've done so much in the last 2 decades for us. And honestly, I'm a little envious of your members that get to call you their member of Congress.
Well, I love them dearly, and all you guys. We couldn't do this without you. I mean, you really have been that North Star. And you've been pushing, and you now have a lot more work to do, given that we have an administration that really is listening, and they're listening to you. And let's do this together.
We will. We'll show up, and we're going to follow your leadership, and we will be there every moment with you. So thank you so much, Congresswoman Lee, for joining us today. Hope I get to meet you one day in person, but thank you so much for everything you do, and it's an honor for us to have you here tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So for the folks that have been with us tonight, I hope you're as floored as I am right now. I'm in awe. It's going to take me a little while tonight to get over this, but don't forget to follow us on Twitch. If you're not already a MoveOn member, you can become a member. For those of you who missed it earlier, we have a website. We're going to start organizing folks around foreign policy. Join us on justiceoverborders.org. If you're an individual, sign up with us. If you're an organization, you want to partner and become a part of that with us, we would love to join with you. This is something that foreign policy should not just be talked about in moments of crises. As Rahna explained tonight, it is something that we have to show up in all those moments and organize together. It not only impacts folks around the world, what we decide and what we do in this country, it impacts us. And it does, as Congresswoman Lee explained, there are resources that are not going to us, that are not going to folks that are just going to continuing the militarism and building up of these weapons. So don't forget to follow us on Twitch, join us on Facebook, become a member, sign up for our SMS. We do great work on that. Join our email list, and we'll give you a shout when we have another live stream coming up. Thanks to our amazing guests, Hoda, Congresswoman Lee, our executive director, Rahna. Thank you to all of the folks who not just did tonight's program, Jordan, Olga, our entire ActTV staff, but also the folks in our product team who built the amazing website, our social folks, everybody. I'm so grateful to work with you. And to all of you watching, we're most thankful for you. Thanks again for everything you do, and have a great night.